Hello, good morning, everyone. Welcome to our event this morning. My name is Sharon Hague. I'm the Senior Vice President for Schools at Pearson. I really appreciate all of you taking the time to join us this morning. It's a real pleasure for me to be here, and I do hope that we will have a lively and interesting debate this morning. We've got lots of interesting and stimulating conversations to kickstart as part of this event this morning. So this roundtable event is really about starting this conversation between teachers and education industry experts. We want to ensure that the work we do to support an inclusive culture in education sector is really impactful and makes a difference to students' outcomes. Now, these conversations aren't always easy and comfortable, and there will be many of us, wherever we might be in the sector, whether it's in the classroom, whether it's running exam boards or creating teaching and learning resources, there is the opportunity for all of us to look at ourselves and look at where we can do better, quite frankly, and where we can really make a difference to improve diversity and inclusion in science. At Pearson, what we're always trying to achieve through our qualifications and through the teaching and learning resources that we provide is that we want to be able to support all learners to receive an education that is accessible, relevant and engaging. We recognise there are things that we can do better, and within the system as a whole there may be bias that is unconscious and not recognised, and we want to prevent this from being the case. We also want to support you, and I know that we've got hundreds of teachers joining the call this morning. We really want to help you, help your schools to be able to address these issues and shape a new way forward. Now, we know that within science there's a gender balance, especially in physics, and we want to discuss that during the event this morning. But we're looking to make sure that all learners can see themselves as future scientists. And we'll be really interested to hear from the panel as to how we can actually reach students, whatever their background that they may come from, whatever their ethnic or background that they might come from, how we can really reach them to help them really get fantastically interested in science and see themselves as future scientists. We've done some work already this year to promote more diverse role models as a starting point in science, and these include the Scientist of the Month resources and career videos showcasing a diverse scientific workforce. What we are looking to do now is review our next steps and to make sure that they're purposeful and effective. So one of the outcomes of the discussion today will be our pledge to move forward and how we're going to move forward, how we're going to focus on improving our resources and qualifications. And it's a real commitment by us to continue this conversation to support diversity and inclusion in science education. So thank you for attending. Please do join in, give the panel your thoughts, your insights, and really enable all of us to work together to build a culture in science education where difference is valued and celebrated. Have a fantastic morning, and I look forward to seeing the outcomes. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Sharon. Good morning, everyone. My name's Andrew Basey. I'm the Policy, Insight and Public Affairs Manager at the Fawcett Society. We're a gender equality campaign charity, and we campaign with our members for women's rights at home, in public life and in the workplace. And we're delighted to be working with Pearson on this event, which is the first in the series of diversity in science events. As Sharon has said, much of the conversation in this area has often been around women in STEM, which is for us an absolutely vital issue. And we really welcome that Pearson are taking an approach which broadens the conversation out to all facets of diversity and seeks to make a good quality science education something that is accessible to everybody. And I know subsequent events are going to particularly focus on culture, on accessibility, and on some of these sort of broader ways of understanding how diversity in science can be approached. To start off with, I'm just going to say a couple of things. Firstly, to flag, some of the nature of some of those differences in access to science education, particularly looking at the undergraduate level. We know that a little under a quarter of physics undergraduates are women, going down to about 15% in materials science. But these differences aren't universal across different areas of science. Around 45% of chemistry undergrads are women. And if you look at some areas like archaeology, it goes even higher. Women are also significantly underrepresented across ICT and maths as well as, of course. When you look at gender and ethnicity, that then varies further. There are obviously fewer women of colour overall accessing these science degrees, given the gender disparity, but more than there are men of colour, and proportionately in some of those areas. And then once you get into specific subject areas, there are even more specific differences too. That some of the outdoor biology subjects have particularly low ethnic minority representation. We know that when we look at disability representation in sciences, there's a trend of gradual improvement, but one that's at around 9%, still far lower than the proportion of the overall population who are disabled people. So there's a lot of different facets to this diversity issue, a lot of areas that we need to bring together ideas and work on. Obviously, at the heart of this agenda is the belief that diversity means an improved sector and means a more innovative sector. We think that the focus for today is on the question of how we can do this, how we can make a good science education more accessible. And I suspect that by your presence on this conversation, you are probably already fairly bought into it. But it is just worth reiterating that all the research is completely clear that the more diverse a team you have working on any issue, the better decisions you make, the more you avoid groupthink. And of course, by having more diverse people working within the relatively well-paid STEM field, we'll also do our bit to challenge the wider sort of societal inequalities that we see by improving access to these roles. So that's enough of an intro from me. I'll just say quickly what we're going to cover as we have these conversations today. We're going to have a bit of a discussion about the role of role models. We're going to move then on to issues around outreach, and then finally talk a bit about the role that teacher training and preparing and supporting teachers has to play in this agenda. Without further ado, let's introduce our roundtable. So I'm just going to quickly remind our roundtable to unmute as they introduce themselves, because that's always a risk on these kinds of conversations. So let's start off. So Jess, could we hear from you, please?
Hi, everyone. My name's Jess Hamer. I work for the Institute of Physics on diversity projects in education. That's me.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. Emma, could we hear from you?
Yeah, my name's Emma Swift, and I'm the Trust-wide Subject Lead for Science for David Ross Educational Trust.
Lovely, thank you. Adil, could we hear from you, please?
Hi, everyone. My name's Adil Laher. I work for Star Academies Trust as a senior leader, but I very much see myself as a science teacher first and foremost.
Wonderful, thank you very much. Ade, could we hear from you, please?
Hello, I'm Ade Gashegwa. I work for Pearson. My role is a lead that represents the interests of minority ethnicities, looking at our content products and how we can better introduce or implement EDI issues in our curriculum.
Fantastic, thank you, Ade. Penny, could you introduce yourself, please?
Hi, I'm Penny Tyso, Projects Director at EDT. We're an education charity, been around for 35 years, connecting young people with industry and providing opportunities.
Wonderful, thank you. Pale, could we hear from you?
Yeah, hi, Pyle Jane. I'm happy to be here today. I chair a not-for-profit organisation called Women in Data, as well as Girls in Data, but I've been in industry for the last 20 years in the banking sector.
Fantastic. And Mary, please.
Good morning, everybody. I'm Mary. I work for, I was a science teacher in state education, in state comprehensives, which is where my interest in including girls and also white working class boys, who I met a lot, who were disengaged in science. I currently work for STEM Learning, and we run teacher professional development, and we're really interested in that world-class science education for everybody in the UK. So we're trying, inclusivity is very much something we're interested in.
Wonderful, thank you, Mary. And finally, I believe, Henna, could we hear from you?
Hi everyone, my name's Hannah Nathwani. I work in the science qualifications team at Pearson, mainly focusing on GCSE science and also creating lots of impactful, useful, engaging resources for students. So really kind of focusing on the learner.
Thank you, Hannah. Now, just before we kick off into our conversation, I've got a little bit of housekeeping to do for the benefit particularly of our delegates. So first point here is just around navigating the platform. So one of the great things about this platform that we're using is there's lots of ways for you, the viewer, to interact with us and share your thoughts, which obviously, will help you to engage with the subject. Also really helps Pearson to hear the ideas that you have out there as well. So the first way to do that is through our Ask a Question box. So down at the bottom, I think, of your screen, there should be a box that looks much like this. Please do put questions as they come to you throughout the course of the conversation into that box. We can see them, the panel can see them, and there are also a few members of the Pearson team on board who will be responding to questions in real time, such as they can. But where they're kind of questions for the panel, questions that we should be bearing in mind as we're having this discussion, we will aim to sort of bring them through into the conversation. I'll be checking in on those every so often just to pull some of your ideas out. And then the other way that we're looking for your sort of feedback and your input is through a couple of short surveys. So the first one will be coming sort of up on your screen momentarily, I believe. And that will ask a sort of few questions about kind of where you are on this issue, just so that we can better understand that. And then at the end of the event, when the webinar sort of closes off, a feedback form will pop up on your screen, and we would be immensely grateful if you can fill those in. I know we get asked to give our feedback a lot nowadays in the world, but they are immensely helpful for the team who run these events, just to know how it's gone for you. And they're also just helpful to make sure that we're continuously improving the offering that we give out to you. Okay. That's all from the housekeeping side, I believe. Yeah, so we'll be launching that survey just now. Would welcome you sort of taking a second to complete that if you can. I think that should be up with you now. So I think we will give you just a moment or two to respond to some of those questions. Okay. Well, I think we'll move on so that you can have a chance to fill in those that survey as the discussion goes on. And given that, let's move on to our conversation. And so the first thing that we're going to be talking about is role models. To kick us off, to get our juices going on this, I'm going to ask Jess from the Institute of Physics to speak a bit about the case study of the work that they do.
Okay. Hello, everyone. can I just check that my slides are there? Yeah. Okay, brilliant. Thank you. So I'm going to be talking a little bit today about the projects that we've been doing at the Institute of Physics over many years now. The IOP has been working on diversity projects for over 15 years, and so I'm going to try and summarise our findings of that in about 5 minutes. So yeah, please bear with me. It's going to be a pretty whirlwind discussion. So a lot of you, I'm sure, are well aware of the issues in science and especially in physics in terms of diversity. But just to outline these a little bit and to draw attention to a few of the facts, our 2018 report, Why Not Physics, found that although girls perform just as well as boys, they only make up 21% of those students actually sitting A-level physics, and that's not budged really for quite a few years now. 68% of schools send less than 2 girls on to A-level physics, compared to 28% of boys. And 65% of girls have physics in their top 4 grades at GCSE, with a 8% progression rate. And you can compare this to 25% and 32% for chemistry and biology, respectively. So you can see here that there's a huge discrepancy in terms of gender. And it's at a school level, but it's also within the subjects if you compare physics to biology and chemistry. So as I said, the Institute of Physics has been working for a long time on these, on gender in particular, and these are some of our reports that you can find on our website. And I'm just going to summarise some of the key findings and things that we found out over the years. So importantly, physics is not the only subject with a serious gender imbalance. This is seen across many subjects across the school. There's only a couple subjects that tend to not have much of a gender imbalance. Schools which beat the odds for physics do so for other gendered subjects. So if, for example, there's a gender imbalance in physics, there is very little gender imbalance in physics, there is probably a very little gender imbalance in English in terms of the numbers of boys choosing English as a subject. Physics is seen as an academic pathway and is viewed as a hard and difficult and elite subject by many. Social conditioning of boys and girls as oppositional, which starts early, is detrimental in terms of the choices they make. And there are circumstances where girls do progress in greater numbers, for example, in single-sex schools, but there is limited research on this, so we need to be a bit cautious when, discussing that. Loads of great work is often done in the physics department, in the science department, but this can be completely undermined if the message isn't consistent across the whole school. So you might hear in other subjects, or students might hear at home about physics or science being difficult, that it's a boys' subject, those sorts of things. So it very much needs to be a whole school initiative. Girls are more positively impacted by having a specialist teacher. Obviously in physics, so a physics specialist teaching their subject seems to have a positive impact, more so for girls than for boys. Advice on jobs that is timely, impartial and tailored, and crucially involves parents and carers, is really important in terms of making students aware of the jobs that are available for them from physics. And inclusive teaching is vital. Bias exists everywhere. It's often unintentional, but it exists in the school community and it exists more widely. So this is a graph on one of our projects. This was a pilot a few years ago now, called the Pearson Pilot Programme. And we saw a tripling in the number of girls choosing to take A-level physics. Now, this was a very small study. It was only 6 schools. So although this was exciting, we need to know whether this is something that can be replicated on a larger scale. And I'm going to give you a little bit of information about what has happened since. So, based on the pilot, the Improving Gender Balance and Pearson pilot programmes, we have an Improving Gender Balance randomised control trial. We're funded by the DFE and externally evaluated by the Institute of Education. It's a 3-year trial, and we currently have 160 schools that have been recruited across England. Half of those schools have been randomly allocated to the control, that's business as usual, normal school life, and half to intervention, which means support from an IGB coach from the Institute of Physics. And based on the findings of the Pearson pilot, we're focusing on 6 key areas of school life. So personal practice, this is talking about inclusive teaching techniques, science and subject capital. There's curriculum and learning, which is all about physics teaching at Key Stage 3 and Key Stage 4 and 5, working with non-specialists and specialists of physics, progression choices and jobs. This is supporting schools with a message about jobs from physics. Student voice. This is listening to what young people have to say and using them as a lever for change in a school. It's also about making young people the experts in physics and giving ownership of the subject to them where possible. Engagement with parents, carers and the wider school community, including governors, especially around jobs and opportunities from STEM. And looking at how internal and external communications can be made more inclusive, particularly in the messaging around physics, trying to make sure those negative messages don't get out there. In the same way as the pilot study, the IGB trial is bespoke to the needs of each individual schools, and we feel that's really important, to really listen to what schools are saying and what their needs are, rather than trying to put a project on a school. And to make a difference, we really need to move from talking about encouraging girls to take physics, to removing the barriers to subject choice more broadly. Young people themselves are not responsible for the lack of diversity in physics. Girls are not a homogenous group, and we need to listen, understand, and remove the barriers that exist for them. As a society, we need to challenge the idea that physics is for the naturally gifted and only for those that are considered brainy. We also need to accept and understand that biases and stereotypes affecting subject choice do exist, and we need to challenge that. In practical terms, we need to see that this is a long-term change in culture. One-off events, one-off initiatives, probably have a very limited impact. It needs to be a long-term change to make a real difference. And this is everyone's responsibility, both within the school and within the wider education community. And this is why we really welcome the effort Pearson is making for change here and enabling a conversation to take place. So the Institute of Physics, what are we doing? So 2020 saw the launch of the Institute of Physics' new strategic phase. This is what will guide and steer our work over the next 5 years. And this brief introduction has focused on Challenge 1. Now you can see there, diversity and skills, which says we want to build a thriving, diverse physics community and play our part in solving the STEM skills shortage by ensuring that young people, no matter their background or where they live, have access to world-class physics education and training. This is a large but really pressing and urgent issue. This work will see us as an organisation spark an influencing campaign with key players to lead the physics community to being more diverse. In particular, we would like to really focus on the following groups of people, and certainly groups that haven't been involved very much in the past in projects. So, for example, disabled younger people, Black Caribbean younger people, those from lower socioeconomic backgrounds, of course carrying on with the work on with girls, and of course this is all intersectional. Our campaign is currently taking shape, and there's a role for all of us to make science truly representative of wider society. Thank you for listening to this introduction on the work from the Institute of Physics.
Thank you, Jess. Fantastic. I mean, I couldn't agree more that we need to look at the whole system. I think that the idea that you can just change how we approach science in schools without changing the perception of whether English is for boys, arts are for boys, whether PE is for girls, all of those things. Totally agree. It needs to be part of that whole, certainly. And I do think that sort of whole is made up of multiple elements. I'm really interested in the idea around girls being more positively impacted by a physics specialist. I wonder whether some of that might just be because that physics specialist might be someone in whom they can see themselves enjoying and being and excelling at physics. So I do think this issue of role models is within that wider whole really important. So we're looking to turn this out then to our panelists. What kind of approaches to bringing in those role models in a kind of systemic way can you think of that you've seen work effectively? Hannah, can we hear from you?
Yeah, sure. So this isn't necessarily an answer to the question. It's more of an observation, really. But so I've got a 3-year-old, and she came home from nursery one day saying all these sorts of things like, farmers have to be boys and pilots must be boys, they can't be girls. And it's amazing how early these sorts of biases and these sorts of things start to come in. And it just really surprised me that we do so much work at kind of Key Stage 3, Key Stage 4, higher up when teachers and students are older. But actually, there's something that we need to, I think, start doing and start focusing on a lot lower down, because those sorts of ideas, I mean, it took me a while to convince her that actually, no, you can do whatever you want. You can be a pilot as well if you want to. And it's not it's not kind of gender specific roles for specific jobs. And I think having those sorts of conversations and just being aware of it, really, because a lot of it is probably things that people are not aware of when they talk about it, because you're unaware of your own unconscious bias. But I think just sort of starting to maybe focus, there might be work that's already done out there, but just a bit more of a focus on those sorts of things at not just primary but nursery level, and then we can kind of build up from there.
Absolutely. Mary, did you want to come back on that?
Yes, I wanted to follow up on what Hannah said, which is, she says her comment is anecdotal, but we know from the work that Louise Archer and her team have done about Science Capital that those ideas about role models and attitudes start very, very early. So our primary team are working with teachers' professional development, looking at what role models you can use as early as nursery. And we have STEM Ambassador Programme, which is people from industry and research can volunteer and go into school and work with a group of students. But picking up on what Jess said, thinking about how those role models are used in schools and moving away from something like a one-off event, and also particularly, we find teachers quite often say, the starting point is, could somebody come and give a talk? Or the STEM ambassadors say, can we come and give a talk? And so trying to move to thinking about not just getting role models into school, but how they are used is really key, I think. So there's the age range thing and being aware, go younger, start with nursery, but don't forget about kids in year 9 making career choices, subject choices. So, but also thinking about the way this role models interact. So thinking about, can a STEM ambassador do something like instigate or work with something like a mini research project the students are doing, and go in over a period of time and perhaps act as somebody who makes suggestions about equipment or approaches, or maybe does some evaluation towards the end of the project about which things have been successful.
Absolutely, that sort of sustained engagement is likely to be much more meaningful. Adil, could you feed in on that point, please?
Yeah, so I've worked in sort of very challenging schools, and one of the issues we had quite a bit, particularly at A level, was the lack of uptake from girls, which is not uncommon. However, where we started to see a real difference was having a female physics teacher, which, we talk about role models, and having a female physics teacher massively improved our uptake of girls in physics. So, I completely agree with the idea that, if we have role models, it should be sustained over a period of time. So I suppose one of the things I come back to is, in terms of teacher training, is there a reason why we don't have as many female physics teachers, or is there something we can do further to sort of enhance subject knowledge that will allow those role models to be seen day in, day out by students, and therefore make them more aspirational and want to do physics at the higher level?
Absolutely. Yes, that's a really good point. Penny, could I bring you on, please?
Hi, just picking up on what Mary talked about in terms of how we really bring role models to the forefront for young people. We do a lot of work with industry, and how we integrate is kind of getting role models to be mentors on projects alongside teachers. So it's very much about using different people within businesses who are willing and able to do that, to be able to talk to the young people about a project they're working on, but also bring in the softer skills element, the teamwork, the communication, and understanding what a workplace might look like. And I think it's really important in discussions like this to kind of take into account that not everybody wants to be a role model or a mentor from a business, and actually we need to be able to support them in doing that, in terms of actually standing up and talking to a business audience might be one thing, but talking to primary or secondary young people might be more of a challenge. So if we can support both sides, it could be that we really link together, and just having that breadth. So actually it has to be about these people that young people might look to and say, that could be me, I could do that in the future, and just how we really make that connection, whatever route, whatever subject area, and as Mary said, from an early age, is so important.
That's a really good point. I in my work do quite a lot of speaking to parliamentarians and some fairly senior officials. I also do a bit of work with school children. You can probably guess which is the most intimidating. Pale, can I bring you in at this point?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with what Mary and Penny were saying in terms of the importance of role models. And at Women in Data, we did some research a while ago, because, maths and sciences are so interlinked in terms of, some of the skill sets. But actually what we found when we started talking to boys and girls is that boys thought maths and science was sociable and collaborative. 71% of boys said that, whereas girls, it was 43%. And, there's this huge part of perception around, what is fun and collaborative. And like I said in my intro, I'm kind of a mathematician, and I've worked in the banking industry in that aspect, but it's been brilliant fun in that it's problem solving. And this is where role models really have a part to play, to bring it to life in terms of what you're doing with your science and math skills to then help solve challenges and problems. And I think it's the art of storytelling that helps kids to really start to feel what it's like, rather than have their perception of what they think it's going to be like, when they start working in a physics environment, once they kind of grow up. And what we found as well is that for boys and girls that follow role models, the stats are amazing in that they're 5 times more likely to become a CEO, 7 times more likely to become C-suite. And so it's really important that we kind of enhance the accessibility of some of these role models, to really get them to connect with, the next generation. And, I think, Adil, to your point, there is a lack of, female physicians or scientists. But I think we need to be creative in who we look to then be the role models. And actually, everyone is a role model to someone. So someone doing A-levels is a role model to GCSE people. And so I think we really need to kind of think outside the box as to who we view in that community.
Yes, a lot of the research does say that the nearer a peer a person is to you, the more likely they are to be seen as a valid role model by the person who's looking up to them. I'm going to sort of slightly switch track this conversation a little, just to the question of our sort of historical role models within the sort of the science curriculum. So obviously the individuals, the people that we bring students into contact with is one part of it, but there's also the question of who they're seeing represented throughout the curriculum they're learning from. What does the panel have any sort of thoughts about that issue? How do we, who do we use as role models in that respect? How do we address some of those quite complex and potentially difficult issues around that? Emma, could I bring you in?
We've actually been on this journey for just over a year now through our work in developing our curriculum. And this is one of the things we looked at initially, was sort of auditing who our young people see in terms of who we talk about in our curriculum. I am a female physics teacher, and so I came from a slightly more neutral viewpoint in terms of the work the IOP had done. And so initially it was about gender. We were looking at gender, but obviously that conversation has changed because we also recognise that we need to talk about other protective characteristics as well. So we started off by auditing and looking at who we were talking about. Now, we can't change who we talk about because the scientific revolution was predominantly delivered through white men, and that is our reality, and we have to talk about that. And their discoveries were extraordinary and need to be acknowledged. But we also need to think about what else we build around that, what context we tell young people in terms of why that was the case, in terms of the social factors at the time. But also then look at who we're representing in the hinterland, the additional knowledge that we share with them, and talking about different people's narratives within that. And so once you go past that initial audit, you need to have open conversations with your teachers, your communities about those people, particularly problematic people who have views and are sharing views that are perhaps not in line with our views and are not inclusive of our communities. And are we unwittingly perpetuating stereotypes, and are we using the right language when we talk about particularly ideas within science? So for us, it was a lot about facilitating those conversations with our teams, hearing our experiences, and then going out into the wider community to find out more, and then reflecting again and coming back to it. So it's quite a process and it's quite a journey, and that does involve role models. It does involve having more representation within your curriculum, but it's also about talking about why the people we have are there, but why they look the way they do, and perhaps why they might say some of the things they said.
That's a really really good way to describe it. I do think there's potentially a strength to be offered to science teaching here of placing things in their context. I mean, something I found out probably a little too recently was that Ronald Fisher, who designed Fisher's t-test, one of the most sort of widely used tests of statistical significance, designed it in order to use it within his work in eugenics. And this is someone who actually went to the same university that I did. So it's sort of that history isn't widely known. It places a lot of not just the people who did science, but the perspective they brought to science in context. And I think it's important for us to ensure that young people understand this. And I think understanding how this the scientific world has come about will probably help them to feel like it's something they need to engage with to improve in some ways, I suspect. Pale.
I was going to just say that, of course we can't change history in terms of, the amazing role models that we all kind of grown up and read about. But I think there are some incredible people and talent that are in the industry today. And I think, we should really elevate and talk about their stories as to how they've got there. We can all look at, Florence Nightingale or, whoever to think about, what they did as big pioneering initiatives. But, that there's so much talent in the industry working in all sorts of sectors, actually. So that's the wonderful thing about science, is that, in your mind, maybe you have the stereotype of, do you work in a laboratory? But actually, there's so much you can be doing, like working Formula One and thinking about engines. So I really think it's important that we're creative in who we look to tell their story. But it's kind of just bringing the generations a little bit closer, I think, is really important to inspire kids today.
Brilliant. I'm just going to turn to Ade now, and then we'll move on to get a bit deeper into the questions around outreach.
Hopefully my audio is okay now. Can you hear me?
Yes,
okay, fabulous. Really just to echo some of what Emma and Pyle have been saying, which is that very often it's about context for young people, especially when you're talking about role modeling. Being able to see people as human and recognizing the influence of that humanness on their decision making, why they did what they did. And actually it's about critical thinking as well for students, recognizing that when they're looking at a scientific paradigm, or they're looking at a particular theory or approach, that was influenced by the perspective of the person who actually implemented that. And it just gives them a much more human feel to science, which, as you all pointed out, can seem quite alien to young people. And I love what you were saying, Pyle, about the contemporariness of science. Science is ever evolving, it's ever changing. There's new ideas, great things happening, and we should be focusing more on more contemporary examples and role models and how they managed to get to where they got to actually support students to understand that. And just one more point with regards to Emma's point about, we can't change the people that came forward with all of these ideas. But even though we can't do that, we can recognize, as you said, the context in which they did that, and the fact that they would have had people who they worked with, who were in the background, who perhaps did the actual work involved in coming up with these ideas, who just weren't recognized. And adding that as well to the mix to say, yeah, this person came up with this great idea, but did they? Who else was there? Who actually informed the development of that idea? I think all of those conversations are great for young people to engage in and actually make science a lot more real, I think, in that sense.
Absolutely. I think that point around the contemporariness of role models, what are we doing to seek out those contemporary role models? We all know Einstein, sure, but like the people who are making these fantastic discoveries now probably won't be such household names. What can we do to bring them into the forefront? It's an interesting issue. Henna has made a brief plea to talk about some of what Pearson are doing in science resources. So let's turn to her, and then we'll go to you, Penny, for a case study on outreach.
I'll be really quick, I promise, Andrew. I just wanted to pick up on what Pyle, Emma and Ade were saying about having not only historical role models, but also having those conversations about why it was those particular people in history that maybe we're not as diverse, and making sure that we equip teachers to be able to have those conversations with students. So, and I think that's the key thing, because if you're not, I know what science teachers are like, I am one, but if you're not sure about something, then you kind of don't really want to go too near the conversation, because it's a little bit uncomfortable. It's a little bit, you're a little bit unsure about how to talk about how to emphasize that content. So I think that's why in what we're trying to do with the science education and in the curriculum that we're currently working on is embedding all of these in the curriculum teaching at GCSE and at Key Stage 3. So we're trying to look at how we can embed these role models, how we can make sure it is part of day-to-day teaching. So it's not an extra, it's not an aside, but it's kind of, it's integrated into the teaching. So if you're talking about a role model, why is it that role model, as you were saying, Ade? Are there other people that we can talk about as well? Are there more current people that are doing exciting things at the moment in science? Can we link that in? And that's what we're looking at integrating into the curriculum. So it's just really interesting that this is what everyone's talking about, and it's great that we're kind of already starting to try and embed those as well.
Great, thank you, Hannah. Okay, Penny, could we please hear from you on a case study of the outreach work that you did?
Yeah, can everybody hear me okay? Great, yes. So thanks for the opportunity. Just to kind of contextualise, and then I'll talk about a particular case study. At EDT, we're working towards the vision of a society where young people have equal access to engage with STEM subjects so they can achieve their potential. And so when asked to join today, it was the thought to be part of this great discussion really important. So thank you, Pearsons, for inviting and hosting. And I then started to think about a case study to talk about, plenty of them, but I felt it right to touch base with one of our alumni, Michelle Watiki. So when I spoke to Michelle last week, I explored her experiences of outreach, key milestones along the way and what had influenced her decisions, whilst reflecting on where she is today and her plans for the future. So meet Michelle. She's proactive, she's an engaging young female, and she's currently awaiting results which will determine where she does her Masters in Advanced Chemical Engineering. So I asked, and Michelle said she's thinking of a future in nuclear or renewable energy, and she does admit that her plan only took her up to this point, as she hadn't always thought about where her career choices might take her later. So Michelle had taken part in 2 of our programmes, Inspire, which is a summer school programme supporting girls through their university choices and soft skills development, and the Year in Industry, which is a year-long work placement with an employer. And Michelle, for that was Rolls-Royce for Michelle. And Michelle did talk about plenty of other summer schools and experiences she took part in. And Michelle recalls, and she said it was her first encounter with EDT around the age of 15 through Inspire that made her realise her desire to pursue a career in STEM. So she talks about enjoying science and maths at school, and she recognises and is thankful for the opportunities she had access to. And Michelle feels she was probably given more free opportunities because of her ethnicity and where she lived growing up. And she said that was really important for her to know that actually she was being given opportunities and could take those opportunities. I'd describe Michelle as particularly proactive, and she does talk about seizing opportunities. And we talked about that not everybody's probably as proactive as Michelle sounds and is, but she'd really want to help others to be so. And she actually explored business and finance through a placement opportunity, but in doing that realised her passion was more for science and engineering. And she's actually talked about discovering that her exposure to role models and mentors along the way, that as you climb the career ladder, you can combine both technical and business acumen. And I think now that's what is part of her future plan. Her first experience of working in a lab was through a Nuffield 12-week placement. And she recalls fondly the commute. And we did kind of laugh at the irony of that, especially now, but also looking back to a young person taking on that journey. But also she reflected really positively on the responsibility that she was given to solve problems at what felt like such a young age. She was given a task to get on with and solve a problem. And I think that really empowered her to think she could do this and do something with the kind of responsibility she was given. At school, Michelle was always encouraged by teachers to share her experiences with younger peers, and we've talked about the importance of kind of role models at different stages, I guess, through your education and employment kind of lifetime. So really thinking about how that can be a positive influence from a young person taking part in experiences. And she would host talks targeting females who had an interest in the sciences, maths, etc., and who wanted to find out more. And when planning for a year in industry placement at the age of 18, one of the main reasons Michelle chose to apply to Rolls-Royce was their emphasis on diversity and inclusion. And as she describes herself being an Afro-Caribbean female in a male-dominated industry, it was really important to Michelle that employers recognise and actively support equality in the workplace. So during her placement at Rolls-Royce, Michelle joined the Afro-Caribbean Professional Network and then went on to co-found a society that supports Black and ethnic females who are progressing through their career, whether it be through education or as young professionals. Michelle talks about this support from kind of teachers, her kind of role models along the way, her employer at the time, and us, CDT, were really valuable in terms of kind of taking things a bit further. So she'd step out and organise outreach events at various universities with a view that this would help provide a platform to create a more inclusive and productive workforce across the country. So as you can tell, Michelle reflects positively on her experiences. She talks really fondly of mentors and role models she's met along the way, and she actually proactively sought out role models who she felt would be beneficial for her and help her in her future. And she does say she uses LinkedIn to keep in touch and thank them for their positive influences when it feels appropriate to do so. So in reflecting, I could have talked to Michelle all day, and I realised that if I could talk to an alumni of a programme of one of ours or many of the other brilliant programmes out there every day of my working life, it would provide so much insight into what works, what doesn't, what the barriers are for young people at different stages of their education and career pathways. So I recognise I'm not lucky enough to do that. However, as an organisation and in partnership with others and people we're talking to today, we are looking to build on our connections with alumni and get them more actively involved in the future offerings of what we offer as an educational charity. So I believe that together we can listen to the voices of the young people, and we've touched on that a bit today. We can empower them through STEM, through developing personal and workplace skills to help them unlock their potential and achieve their goals. Even if young people at early ages don't even know what their goals are, we can all be part of helping that journey. We believe that through offering multiple opportunities and interventions through an educational journey and connecting young people with employers and mentors and role models, we can really help to increase STEM capital, and we've talked about that a bit today as well, and by giving young people a better chance to see themselves with a future in STEM. It's worth noting that in response to COVID-19 at the moment, as an organisation, as many are, we are transforming to a new era of remote and virtual engagement mixed with face-to-face when possible. And we do recognise that the attainment gap has widened considerably. So really looking at how we can help address this and support education, schools and partners through becoming more flexible in our delivery models, working closely with schools, colleges, universities, etc. on priorities alongside industry, and building on our work on diversity and inclusion. So I think in summary, working in collaboration, we can all excite young people about STEM from an early age, and we've touched on that this morning. We can support along the education pathway from at whatever stage it starts in terms of their thinking, be it a 3-year-old, through education to employment, and hopefully transform their futures. And I just thought to end and bringing it back to Michelle, when I spoke to her, I asked her what advice she might give to teachers or young people. And she said, based on some advice she was once given, don't be that person who doesn't have anything to say on your personal statement, even when you don't know what a personal statement is or how you might use it. Fill your life with experiences that you can talk about, and take opportunities as they arise, as you never know where they might take you. So I thought that would be a nice way to end. Thank you for listening.
Fab. Thank you, Penny. So yeah, really interesting example of the sorts of outreach work that EDT do and some of the impact it's had on Michelle. It sort of feels to me like there's loads of different forms of outreach that have benefited her, from the mentoring and networks and so forth that EDT provide, but also just some of the sort of clear commitments to diversity from Rolls-Royce that made her feel, okay, this is an environment that I want to move into. That sounds really positive. So I kind of want to start off with something that we'd discussed previously in some of our discussions that sit behind this discussion, was this question of, is there a bit of a north-south divide in that kind of industry engagement? Adil, do you want to interject with some points, some thoughts on that?
Yeah, so I mean, having worked in the north, I'm quite acutely aware of the limited opportunities students have to access or going into the real world of science. And I'm a firm believer that actually, we're a product of the experiences that we have. So if a student isn't able to go out and see something in action, they're going to find it very, very difficult. So this is where the north-south divide really sort of comes in, because obviously there's very limited number of opportunities for students, particularly in the north where I work, for them to go out and experience industries that will allow them to go into, get a feel for science. So I think, we need to look at what possibilities, what avenues are there for students to go out and actually see something day in, day out, or quite regularly, if we're going to sort of have that impact or increasing diversity within science.
Because definitely the question of how do we get industry into education and education into industry more is clearly a real part of that. I mean, what kind of practical support do you think that we need to see available to make that happen more effectively? For those who are sort of doing this in practice day in, day out, what would you like to see happen to make this more effective? Jess, do you want to say something about that?
Yes. So one thing that we found from our work with students and schools is that where you give students the ownership of the science, of the physics, then they sort of, there's a more of an internalisation that they can become the physicists, they can become the scientists. So I personally would really welcome from industry, from universities, more opportunity for young people to become the experts in a particular area, and for those people in those organisations to be able to support them and applaud those young people for doing that.
That's really interesting. I suppose what I would maybe throw back as a potential challenge there is that what we're then asking people in the industry to do is something that's a lot closer to pedagogy, right? That's quite difficult to know how to do that compared to coming in and saying a bit about the job that you do. So I think there is a challenge there of how are we skilling up people who are coming from industry into education to enable them to do that work. One of the questions that we have from our participants is one which I think is really relevant to this point. They ask, so this is from Rebecca, she asks, are there any suggestions of how schools can get parents to change their views on gender roles? So this, I think, comes back to this question of outreach. Who are we reaching out to? Is it just getting employers in to talk to schools, or is there more of a question of how do we affect the whole environment? Has anyone got any experience trying to work with parents that they want to speak to in relation to this? Mary, far away.
So I think one thing that is really useful when working with parents is to, they often are not very clued up about what science is and what it involves. And so I think if you can invite parents in, you often see parents being invited into primary and secondary schools for the English department or modern foreign languages. And I think a parents' evening or a day where children can show what they're doing in science and perhaps present a project, or perhaps where there can be hands-on opportunities to work together, I think that can really change attitudes.
Brilliant. Penny, do you want to feedback on that point as well?
Yeah, I think it's really important. I think a lot of us talk about how to engage and with parents to kind of bring the messages through. Some of the programs we run are kind of experience day based on a one-day experience from a young age through, and we've run some STEM family challenges, which was doing kind of activities, bringing the parents into the team with the young person to solve a real life problem, hands-on activity, bringing role in twilight sessions after school hours. It's one of the harder things to facilitate and run, but actually really beneficial when we get it right in the areas we can. I think engaging and getting parents to come, I think, is one of the challenges, and I think we've worked with others and partners on that in terms of why do I attend? We've also, with some of our kind of project-based work, there's a launch, there's a midpoint with mentors, and there's an end point which we call the celebration, which can be an assessment day depending on the age group. But with the Industrial Cadets Awards, we know the young people will get an award at the end of their experience. So we use that as a graduation and a celebration to invite the parents along, so they get to see and feel what the young people have done through their week-long, 2-week-long, 6-month-long program, and it just really engages kind of at that level. So I think we all need to kind of think creatively and do as much as we can for parental engagement. And just talking on one of the earlier points, I'm a mother of a 4-year-old daughter and a 10-year-old son, and one of the favourite books at the moment is Fantastic Women That Change the World, basically, and it's just about let's use our great women who change the world. So use our language from a really young age. So when I'm reading to my 4-year-old, let's put all of that in their minds. So as a parent, I take that responsibility. So the more we can do to kind of engage parents in different ways, I think we'll start to kind of move this on and make the change that we're trying to do.
This question around how we engage parents is a very difficult one. something I probably should have flagged earlier is that the Forces Society is currently doing a commission on gender stereotypes in early childhood, looking particularly at 0 to 7s. And this question of how can we engage with parents and get them to reflect on the way that stereotypes can be transferred or can be challenged is a difficult one. It is a complex one. One of our sort of top tips is for parents to model the kind of role model they want children to see. I think changing how our parental leave systems work is probably a key part of that, but that's a slightly aside. Pale, do you want to come in on this point around parents?
Yeah, I think there's so much pressure on teachers and the education system, but parents do have such a key role, especially now, when everyone's homeschooling. But what we found from our Women in Data research is that 68% of boys said their parents actively encouraged them in their learning, whereas it's only 51% for girls. And so, there's all sorts of potential natural biases that are happening every day out there in the real world. And I just think, part of it is encouragement is the role of the parent. Part of it is to be active. I love the idea, Penny, of, the family learning sessions. So, you can go through the journey together. But, there's several different levers, I guess, that parents need to play. And I know it's adding a lot to the parent as well, but I think in order to kind of win this and get gender equality in sciences, it is really key.
It's a good point that there is a lot already on parents. I think, we talk sometimes about like total motherhood and things like that, these ideas that parents are constantly subjected to these vast expectations. So that is certainly something to bear in mind when we try and do this work. I'm just going to quickly flag two resources that both our panelists and our participants, our delegates have suggested. So on the question of finding new role models, Lisa flags that Twitter is great for identifying these, and that the hashtag #BlackInSTEM is a really good example of one that we can look up and sort of see who's tweeting under that to identify some of these role models. And then Mary on our panel flags that when we talk about the difficulty for people from industry acquiring skills to work with young people in STEM, they have an online training and support for their ambassadors. So that's a potential route to sort of getting some of that support for people in industry. Just going to, in terms of this question of outreach, one of the questions from our participants is, they directed this to the IOP, but I think it applies much more widely. Have we thought about special schools and any useful programs available in that kind of environment? So that's sort of a question of how do we do this work and engage with people with special educational needs and disabilities. Is that something that anyone on the panel has some thoughts that they could respond on? Penny, go ahead.
Hi, thanks. We've run some of our kind of programs, which 10-week project for 12 to 14-year-olds. We did some work funded by the IET and working with AkzoNobel on adapting and changing that for special educational needs schools in the local area. And we found that we didn't want to assume that the project in the form it was would be relevant and applicable, but we did work with the school, very closely with the school, with selecting mentors and role models from AkzoNobel who were able, willing and kind of keen to work with the schools, and did a lot of work to make sure that all of those kind of the foundations were laid. So that project really worked, and we've got a really nice kind of summary and story that we could tell in terms of the difference that made to the young people, and how, because it was over a length of time, it really helped support the young people rather than a one-day experience. But obviously that takes commitment from the school, from the company. One of our partners, GFG Foundation, who's linked with all the Liberty businesses, we're looking at a pilot in the Midlands before lockdown for young people with autism, and that's again just taking one of our recycle and reuse projects that's used in schools and tailoring it, adapting it for the audience. So I welcome discussions on this and working with others, because we want to do more of it, and I think it's a real opportunity to look at what exists and then work from what the impact it's had, but then tailor so it can be relevant for different audiences and really focus. We've also, through the Careers and Enterprise Company, done some work in pupil referral units. So again, just looking at how we can change and adapt what's delivered to meet the needs of different environments and settings, working really closely with teachers and the establishments themselves.
Okay, so that's really helpful. That's something maybe for our participant there to follow up with EDT. Mary's flagging to me that she wants to come in. Go for it.
Hi, some really interesting work being done also for autism, transition to university and things like that. So if you look at the National Autistic Society, there's lots of stuff on there, and University of Leicester's students, their autistic students, have put some things about what it's like to be an autistic person at university and hints and tips on, so enabling autistic students in particular to envisage that next step. But also I wanted to flag up University of Edinburgh and an organisation in Scotland are producing a British Sign Language glossary of science terms. So if people are working in special schools or have got deaf students in mainstream, then that's another thing to look. I'll just look for a way to share a link with you for that.
Brilliant, thank you. Ade, do you want to speak a bit about this issue?
Sorry, I was just typing away there, Andrew. There are quite a number of projects actually around the country with regards to internships and placements for young people, particularly with autism. There's a number of them across the board. And if you have a look, just type in, interestingly, to Google, and you should see some opportunities for your local hospital who offer these internships. They're quite common now in the NHS. They're short-term internships, but also if you're thinking about your students progressing and going from school into work, there's a fantastic project called Project Search, which I always used to recommend to parents when I was a teacher, sort of thinking about more encouraging young people to get into the workforce. They're not strictly science opportunities, and they're not all medical opportunities, but they tend to have quite a number of placements in these sorts of areas. So that sort of thing, thinking about what internships there are out there, and I know they're not, a lot of them are about individuals with autism, but they do broaden out to individuals with other sorts of educational needs. So I just thought I'd flag that. So Project Search, check your local hospital. They do offer these project placements and internships.
Fantastic, that's really helpful. We have a link for that BSL dictionary, and I'm sure we'll be able to rummage up a link for Project Search as well, which we'll be able to share via emails after the event. Just, I suppose, one sort of challenge from me, sort of linking into our question about role models and the diversity, accessibility of those, is just for those who are doing this kind of outreach work, how much do we feel like the people who actually end up doing that work are diverse? Do we feel like we get a representative sort of group of those people that can really link into the communities that they're working with? Or is some of the, do we see a kind of perpetuation in those who are able to do that outreach work? Anyone from amongst those? Jess, far away.
Hi. So I think it's quite a tricky balancing act, because I do think obviously people that do outreach, it could be more. It could and should be more diverse, but there's also the risk that those that are from underrepresented groups are then overused in terms of outreach and just become the spokesperson for whichever STEM subject they belong to, and that distracts from their actual own career path, and often obviously these are not paid roles either, so I think it's a balance, isn't it? I think we need to encourage greater conversation and also understanding that we can all be advocates for diversity as well. We all need to be talking about it. It's not just those of us from underrepresented groups that need to be talking about it. It's for everybody.
absolutely, very good point. I think there's probably something with of how that kind of work is valued by employers as well. If you're working for a certain employer and you're doing the work to go out and do that outreach, are they viewing that as an important part of their business, or is it a sort of fun thing that you get to do as a side thing, which they don't really value, which I think we need to think about too. But yes, it's a really valid point. Okay, I'm going to move our conversation along now just to the sort of final area that we were hoping to cover today, which was this question around the support and training that teachers need in order to be able to do some of this work and have these conversations about diversity. I know this is something that's coming up in the questions among our participants. Should we not be educating educators about unconscious bias, including their own attitudes to society? I suppose bearing in mind that quite a lot of science teachers won't be social scientists, what do we think we have to do to enable them to have these conversations? We'll turn that out to our panel. Emma, fire away.
This is something that we've been looking at quite a lot. And I think we've talked before about the idea of being able to have open, honest conversations. And I know various people have talked about the fact that we as teachers don't always feel like we are knowledgeable enough to have the conversations, or are so frightened of having the wrong conversation that we can make matters worse. So there is an issue around initially creating a culture that allows that conversation to happen. And now ideally that's coming from school governance, but it might not be. And it might be something that you want to pick up within your own department. And if that is something that you want to sort of drive forward, start the conversation with your own teams in terms of what do we want to talk about? What are the hard questions we want to ask? What do we feel that we don't know? And then looking for places where we can signpost those staff to find that out. And then come back together and keep reflecting. Now, that in terms of CPD, I don't think we do that well enough in terms of initial teacher training. I don't think we talk about diversity of representation in initial science teacher training. But, certainly for those of us who are further in our careers, we have a space perhaps to think about where we can develop CPD. And that might be about training around teaching difficult or problematic people in terms of the context around it. It might be looking at the inclusivity of the language we use. We teach a lot of topics which have overlaps with diversity, and we need to think carefully about the language used within that context. But also it might be, and this has been touched on a lot from the whole panel today, how do we include different people, not our typical people, to ensure that we're doing that. And that's three quite big strands of CPD, and there isn't a great deal out there to support you. I'll be really honest with you in terms of there isn't somewhere you can just go and they will just tell you that. So it might be something that you need to develop as your own community, and you want your staff in your community to share their own lived experience. And if you develop a culture where these things are being talked about, they will, and you'll often find those expertise within your wider community that will really help you grow and share and develop your curriculum because of that.
Brilliant. Jess, do you want to come in on this question?
Yeah, I've got a few points to make on this. Completely agree everything Emma's just said. It's not just a one-off piece of training isn't going to solve the issue. It needs to be an ongoing discussion. And I mean, we've found that really, there needs to be SLT buy-in within the school for this, and it needs to be not just within the science department. The conversation needs to be across the whole school, including parents, school governors. Everybody needs to be talking about bias, about diversity, and looking across subjects across the whole school. In terms of specifically within the classroom, there is some evidence that bias exists, particularly around questioning. This is something that one of our previous projects has found out, that boys are more likely to put their hands up, ask questions, get involved, and teachers are more likely to respond to that than girls. But obviously that is a generalisation, but it's just something that we've picked up. And also within the science department, subject-specific CPD we found to be really important for physicists, and it's almost an indirect consequence. So, if non-specialists do have that support, like for example from our SPN project, we found that there was an increase in the number of students from pupil premium choosing A-level physics of 46%, as well as for girls 45% increase. So it's supporting those teachers with the subject, with their subject knowledge and engaging ways of teaching and inclusive ways of teaching, but also a whole school look at diversity and the messages that are out there.
Brilliant, thank you. I mean, one of the things that sort of strikes me about this is this question of you point out some of these statistics around boys having being picked more often with their hands up. That's something that we might hear as a stat, but how much as an individual teacher are you able to really have the space to reflect on your own practice and whether that's happening in your classroom? If so, what's your response to it? Is it there's something wrong with the girls, or is it there's something I need to change about how I am doing this teaching? Definitely there are sort of anti-racist teaching principles that getting here a lot of from the United States, which kind of focus on this question of reflecting on the way that you are teaching and what can be done to make that more accessible. Can we hear from Henna and then Mary, please?
I just wanted to pick up on the comments about unconscious bias, and also I noticed there's a question about resources for contemporary scientists as well, which we kind of touched on in our discussions. But I was just thinking, actually, I don't think we have anything specific around contemporary scientists, scientists that are doing things at the moment, because there must be so much out there that we can quite easily put together for schools to help have these conversations. But it's not just giving people a list of names. I think the other point is around giving people a narrative as well around talking about various people, so that using the diversity angle, so trying to make sure that we're giving teachers the tools, if you like, to be able to confidently talk about it. And I think that will really, really help. So we can definitely look at producing something like that and then integrating it into the curriculum.
Mary?
Just going back to what Emma said about collaborating in your department, I'm thinking as well about a point Henna made about perceptions amongst boys and girls about whether science is collaborative. And a lot of the teachers that I work with, they say we've got especially in secondary, especially in exam years, got this content-heavy curriculum, and we've got this, problem that there's a perception it's fact-based. So in that conversation, also look at how can you change the culture of the way science is taught, and making sure that you include some collaborative activities, some problem solving, to try to shift that perception and to try to model what the culture of science is like within a science lesson. I think that's really important. And I appreciate the thing about the content heavy and how do we find time, but my experience is if you can engage students in those activities, they get more interested in the science, they become better at being independent learners, so you can kind of spin it so that they do more work for themselves. So there's that aspect. There was something else I was going to say and I've forgotten, so I shall be quiet.
I just wanted to add to Mary's point, actually, because it's not just about making it collaborative in the classroom, because actually these are the skills that are needed when these young people are going to go out to work. These are the things that we spend our lives doing on our daily basis. So they're not wasted skills. And actually, it's these skills that really allow the individuals to succeed in their jobs and roles going forward. So, these are life skills, actually, that, that collaboration, the problem solving, working together towards that common goal, that is so important that we get right and start kind of embedding some of these disciplines in when they're young.
Fantastic. Mary, have you recalled your point?
Yeah, sorry. Pales actually led into it really nicely. the WISE campaign, Women into Science and Engineering, have done some work looking at girls' perception of jobs, and they've identified that instead of talking about what you do in a job, if you can talk about what kinds of personality traits and skills are useful in a job, that's much more accessible to girls and gets them much more interested. And I think actually also when we're looking at other underrepresented groups, those kinds of approaches might be helpful. So again, that's an argument for, you know, please try to fit in your problem solving and your collaboration, and be brave enough to move to a different way of teaching if you're not already.
Brilliant, thank you. So I feel like that collaboration point is a really good point. Ade is flagging to me in the private presenter chat some of the some ideas like including an RSS feed from engaging science websites within your virtual learning environment to kind of help bring through you know, different ideas into your teaching. Just in terms of some of those, we've spoken about giving teachers some of the tools that they need to have these conversations, to reflect on their own practice, make sure it's inclusive of diversity. Just in kind of the last 5 minutes that we have with this conversation, has anyone got any thoughts on what those tools actually need to look like? What do teachers need in order to be able to do this work? What does that practically look like? Yes, fire away.
Okay, so I think teachers have a lot going on in the classroom. There's, you know, trying to you know, fit everything into the lesson. It's got to be things that are already there. So and working with, you know, what already exists. So it's about sort of having things, you know, if you are looking at your scheme of work, making sure those links and those resources are already embedded in the scheme of work. So there's no sort of like, oh yeah, I remember that great resource, I'm having to find it when, you know, when your lesson's about to start. It's about having the systems and everything in place already, and also about teachers being given the space and the capacity to be able to do this and to be able to have those conversations in department time, and again, that's, you know, that support from, you know, senior leaders in the school to be able to provide that that space for conversation and you know, working on those schemes of work and, you know, engaging with parents.
That's a very good point. I suppose just for any SLT listening to this, that in-department time point feels like it's quite an important one. Henna, do you want to come in on this, and then Emma?
Yeah, just quickly, just picking up on what Jess said about embedding it into the curriculum. I think I'd mentioned this earlier as well, but it's just teachers are ridiculously busy. They have so much pressure on their time, especially at the moment. And I think anything we can do to make it easy for them. And from the conversation today, the main takeaway that I've got is actually there is so much information out there, and there's so much advice, and there are so many schemes and so many things that teachers can do. But I think a lot of it is actually finding that and making it easy, kind of like a one-stop place for everyone to be able to find that information easily. So I think if we have something like, so we obviously have schemes of work at Pearson, if we can try and integrate these sorts of projects or the kind of the guides, those sorts of things into our schemes of work, then I think that would make it really, really easy. So then you can just say, here's a lesson, this is what this links to this. Oh, and by the way, there's all these amazing resources and these ambassadors that you can draw on virtually in this world maybe, and then take it from there. Because I think time is precious for teachers, so anything we can do to help support that is going to be well received.
I completely agree. I strongly believe that if you can make the space and time for people to talk about this, we've embedded all of this in our curriculum, and we have in our teacher guidance, we have advice about how to teach particular topics so that people know what to do, but also links to organisations where they can get further information if they want to go and research it further. I think one thing I wanted to say is, if we can get this right and we do get the climate right in our own schools, what it does do is it allows those members of staff who have protected characteristics to be open with their students and role model on a daily basis with them. And I think that's possibly one of the most important things about going on a journey like this, is you do enable the people that your young people come in contact with every day to share their own personal experiences and actually be able to talk about it without having to go out to industry, without having to go out to external organisations, and actually feel confident that they are supported in having those conversations with the young people.
That's such an important point. I think that if you're not using the full diversity of your teachers, of the people that your children are coming into contact with, you're definitely missing out on a trick in this, and enabling them to feel free to do that is such an important point. I'm just being flagged that we're finishing up in 5 minutes, so I think it's important we do wrap up at this stage. But I think, yes, that point around ensuring that we are doing things within existing schemes of work, not adding too much additional strain on teachers is absolutely vital. Just to flag that there's a lot of work going on in Pearson. Forza are doing some of that work with them at the moment on how they make all of their editorial content across all of the different strands of work accessible, what some of the overarching rules are to make that happen effectively. I think that that is obviously a key part of what they can do on this point around on the resources that they provide. So I think we probably need to wrap up at this stage. We've got a couple of final questions which I think work well as wrap-up ones, and those are from our participants. One says, I'd like to do some projects related to STEM and improving inclusion. Are there funding streams available I can apply to? And one says, working in a school where there's huge diversity, economic factors are known to affect our students, how can we get involved in some of these projects? So I guess just if there's a couple of people who want to chime in with how to get involved and how to get some of this work going based on the work that you're doing, that would be great. Anyone want to chip in? Penny, go for it.
Yeah, I think if there's a follow-up to the sessions today, and we could just include links and kind of reference points, but I think Hannah's point's really valuable. There's so much information out there, and I think our job as a collective and others is to kind of make this as easy to access and signposting straightforward. So it'd be really good to kind of do some of that off this session to bring that together and say, here's some access to resources and ways to do these things and supporting. And kind of one of the elements that we always have is the industry link. So some areas that's easier than others, but we will always work to have an industry link in terms of what we do. So yeah, if we could bring some of that together post this for the teachers, that would be great.
Fantastic. So I think the follow-up emails will definitely share the available resources through Pearson. I'm sure we'll contribute to ensuring that covers as many bases as possible for all of the people who are viewing this discussion. Okay, so I'm going to bring it to a close now. Just to sort of quickly recap. So in terms of the conversation around role models, really valuable. It felt to me like the two key things there with this point around context for the historical role models that we're using, and the contemporariness of the those coming in from industry, those that we talk about. Can we find more modern examples of role models that we can use, and what are some of the ways that we can effectively do that? I think when we're talking about outreach, some sort of really good ideas about getting into parents and how we can support them, and what we can do to make it easier for people within education settings to access some of that support. And then when we talk about the discussion and support for training for teachers, reflects on the fact that teachers have limited time and resources. So what can we do to make everything fit into the work that they're already doing, and bring those resources together for them as effectively as possible. Okay, so we're gonna wrap up now. Thank you so much, everyone, for your contributions. It's been a really fascinating discussion. I've learned a lot and really enjoyed the conversation. And just to finally say to all of our participants, please do fill in the feedback forms. It's so valuable to hear what you thought of the session. That's really appreciated by all of our panelists and by Pearson. So thank you very much, everyone.